The candles in the Hadley assembly rooms had been lit for an hour, and every woman in the county who owned silk had worn it. Margaret Lennox owned none. She stood at the edge of the room in a cotton gown her aunt had turned twice, her gloves mended at the fourth finger where the stitching had given way last autumn, and her hands, which she kept folded at her waist, still carried the faintest trace of ink along the side of her left thumb. She had scrubbed it with lemon and salt that afternoon. The lemon had not been enough. Across the room, Lady Honoria Ashworth, the Dowager Countess of Thornfield, surveyed the company with the quiet authority of a woman who had never once entered a room and found it arranged against her. Beside her stood Miss Cecily Fairfax, whose pearls caught the light exactly as pearls should. And beside Miss Fairfax, half a step behind, stood Lord Benedict Ashworth, the Earl of Thornfield, whose expression suggested he had calculated the precise number of minutes remaining before he could leave. He was not looking at the dancers. He was not looking at Miss Fairfax. He was looking, with the particular stillness of a man who did not wish to be caught looking, at the fourth finger of Margaret Lennox's left glove, where the mended stitching made a ridge she kept pressing flat with her right thumb. He looked away. If you have ever walked into a room and understood, before a single word was spoken, that the room had already decided what you were, then you already know what Margaret felt in that moment. Stay close. The autumn of 1814 had not been kind to Margaret Lennox, and the winter would be less kind still. Sir Giles Lennox, Margaret's father, was a man of firm convictions and modest acreage. 640 acres of Hertfordshire farmland, a stone house older than the family's claim to gentility, and a library that had once held 400 volumes. The library held none now. Margaret's mother, Catherine, had been the reader. She had come to the marriage with her own collection, a bride's trunk packed not with linens and plate, as Sir Giles had expected, but with volumes of verse, natural philosophy, and histories of the ancient world. Catherine Lennox had read aloud at breakfast, annotated in the margins of her cowper in a hand so fine it looked like pressed flowers, and taught her daughter to read at 4, with a finger tracing the opening lines of a book of fables. She had died when Margaret was 14, in the January of 1806, of a fever that moved through her lungs like weather through a valley. Sir Giles had closed the library door on the morning of the funeral. By evening, he had locked it. By the following week, the books had been carried in crates to a dealer in Ware, and the shelves stood bare as a stripped orchard. He kept only the Bible and the farm ledger. He did not explain. He did not need to. Margaret understood. Her mother's happiness had lived inside those books, and her mother's happiness had not kept her alive, and Sir Giles Lennox could not forgive the pages for surviving when his wife had not. Margaret had saved one volume, a slim book of verse, small enough to fit inside a folded apron, its leather cover soft from years of handling. Her mother's handwriting filled the margins. She kept it wrapped in a cloth beneath the straw in the far stall of the stable, where the old mare stood patient and unbothered by the girl who came in the dark with a candle, and read until the first gray light touched the roof beams. She had read that single volume so many times she could recite every annotation from memory. The stable smelled of hay and tallow, and the warm animal patience of a creature that expected nothing from the night. Margaret read there, because the house was watched. Sir Giles checked her room, checked her work-basket, checked the pockets of her coat when she came in from the garden. He believed he was protecting her. He believed that books had made Catherine restless, had drawn her attention upward and inward until she forgot the solid ground beneath her, and that the same affliction would ruin Margaret if he did not guard against it. What he did not know was that Margaret had memorized enough to carry a library inside her body. She could recite passages from her mother's annotations while hanging linen. She could work through the first 40 lines of Pope while churning. The words lived in her mouth and hands and in the cadence of her breathing, and no lock on any door could reach them there. Lady Honoria Ashworth had said it first, 3 days before the assembly, in the drawing-room at Thornfield, while the tea was still warm. Margaret knew this because Phipps, the Lennox groom, had heard it from the Thornfield coachman, who had stood outside the door while the dowager spoke. The odd Lennox girl. The words had traveled the way all verdicts travel in a country neighborhood, by groom and coachman and kitchen door, until they reached Margaret as she stood in the stable at dawn, with the candle guttering and her mother's book open on her knees. She had closed the book carefully. She had pressed her thumb to the place where her mother had written, in the margin beside a verse about patience, the single word, soon. The assembly was meant to be the occasion of Miss Fairfax's quiet triumph. Lady Honoria had engineered the evening with the precision of a general arranging cavalry. Cecily Fairfax had £10,000, the right relations, a face designed for portraiture, and the good sense never to voice an opinion that might disturb the wallpaper. She played the pianoforte with technical competence and no feeling whatsoever, and she had been placed beside Lord Thornfield at dinner 4 times that autumn. Margaret's invitation had been an afterthought of parish obligation. Sir Giles sat among the older men and drank his port, and did not dance. Margaret stood at the far wall, her mended glove pressed flat, and watched the room move without her. She was 22, and had no fortune, no accomplishments the county recognized, no silk, and, as far as anyone present knew, no conversation beyond the domestic. She was, by every measure the assembly understood, invisible. Lord Thornfield had spoken to her once. It had happened in the vestibule, where Margaret had gone to collect her father's coat. And Thornfield had come, she supposed, for the same purpose, or for the relief of a room that talked too much. He had looked at her hands, specifically at the ink. His voice, when it came, had been level and unhurried. "You write," it was not a question. Margaret had pulled her glove higher. "I copy recipes for Mrs. Tate. Recipes do not require that much ink, Miss Lennox." He had turned and gone back into the assembly before she could answer. She stood in the vestibule holding her father's coat and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could name, that someone had read her as closely as she read her mother's margin notes. 3 days after the assembly, Margaret received a note from Thornfield. Not from Lord Thornfield himself, from his housekeeper, Mrs. Campion. Lady Honoria required a woman to read aloud to old Mrs. Fenton, the dowager's elderly companion, whose eyes had failed. The position was unpaid, the hours were Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and the books were to be selected by Lady Honoria. Margaret had no cause to refuse. Sir Giles, who had never forbidden her from reading aloud to the old and the sick, consented. He did not consider it reading, not properly. Reading was the solitary vice, the closed door, the turned page in the dark. Reading aloud was service. Margaret arrived at Thornfield on a Tuesday afternoon in a gown she had pressed with a cool iron and her hair pinned with no ornament. The house was larger than she had expected. The entrance hall alone was wider than the Lennox kitchen and parlor combined, floored in dark stone that had been polished until it held the reflection of the windows, and the air inside carried the particular chill of rooms with high ceilings and more space than warmth. A footman took her coat without speaking. Mrs. Campion, a woman of perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she had opinions she was paid not to voice, led her down a corridor lined with portraits Margaret did not recognize, and through a door into the morning room. Mrs. Fenton sat in a high-backed chair near the window, with a rug on her knees and a glass of barley water she had not touched. She was small and very old. her hands spotted and folded in her lap like a pair of gloves set aside for the season. Lady Honoria had selected a volume of sermons. The leather was stiff, and the pages had never been cut, which meant Margaret was the first person to open them, which meant Lady Honoria had chosen the book for its category, rather than its content. Margaret broke the pages with her thumbnail, glanced at the first line, and began. The sermons were dry. Mrs. Fenton's eyes were closed within 3 minutes, her breathing slow and even, the barley water untouched, the rug sliding from her knees. Margaret reached forward and adjusted the rug without pausing her reading. She turned the page. The morning room smelled of beeswax and the faint lavender that Mrs. Campion kept in the linens, and the light from the window fell across Margaret's hands, and across the open book, and across the pale cotton of her gown, and the room was quiet in a way the Lennox house had not been quiet in 8 years. She read on. She read because the room was quiet, and the book was in her hands, and the physical act of turning a page and letting the words pass through her throat into the air was, after 8 years of reading by candlelight in a stable, a luxury that stopped her breath. Her voice found the rhythm of the prose even when the prose resisted rhythm, even when the sentences were wooden and the arguments pedestrian, because Margaret read the way her mother had taught her to read, which was with the assumption that every text, however poor, had been written by a person who meant something by it, and that the reader's work was to find the meaning and carry it forward. She did not know that Lord Thornfield was standing in the corridor outside the morning room. She did not know that he had been on his way to the study and had stopped at the sound of her voice. Not because the words were worth stopping for, they were sermons, but because the quality of her attention was. She read the way some women played music, with the whole of her body involved. Her shoulders had dropped. Her hands, which she had held clasped and guarded at the assembly, rested open on the book. Her voice carried the measured warmth of someone who believed the words deserved the care of being spoken well, even when the words were dull. The light moved across the page as a cloud passed, and she paused and turned the leaf, and the small sound of the paper turning carried into the corridor where he stood, with his hand on the door frame and his breathing held. He stood there for 7 minutes. Then he went to his study and closed the door and sat for a long time with his hand on the breast pocket of his coat, where a letter lived that he had carried for 8 years and had never been able to answer. The second time Cecily Fairfax said it, Margaret was present. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into the reading arrangement, and Cecily had arrived at Thornfield for tea with Lady Honoria. Margaret was crossing the entrance hall with a volume of sermons when Cecily turned to Lady Honoria's niece and said, with the polished confidence of a woman who had never needed to be careful with her words, "I do think it is kind of your aunt to give the odd Lennox girl something to occupy her. One can only imagine what she would do with her afternoons otherwise." She said it as one might comment on the weather. Margaret's stride did not break. Her hand tightened on the spine of the book. The ink stain on her thumb, which she had stopped trying to scrub away, pressed white against the leather. In the mirror above the hall table, she saw her own face, composed and distant, and behind it, half reflected in the glass, Lord Thornfield on the staircase, his hand on the rail, his body entirely still. Something in his expression had changed. She could not name it. She was not meant to see it. She saw it. The reading sessions changed. Margaret arrived on a Tuesday to find that Mrs. Fenton was asleep and a different book had been left on the side table. Not sermons. A volume of natural history, its spine uncracked, a folded sheet of paper marking the first chapter. The paper bore no message. The following Thursday, a slim edition of verse. The Tuesday after that, A translated history of Rome. Each time the book appeared without explanation, placed where Margaret would find it before Lady Honoria arrived to supervise. Margaret did not ask who had placed them. She knew the way one knows the direction of a current before the water shows it. She read them in the morning room with Mrs. Fenton drowsing. And she read them in the stable by candlelight with her mother's book beside her. And she felt, for the first time in 8 years, that the locked door in her father's house had been opened from the other side. "Come to the library," Lord Thornfield said one afternoon, finding her in the corridor after Mrs. Fenton had been carried up to bed. It was an order. His voice carried the same level authority he used with his steward, his tenants, his dogs. Margaret's body heard the warmth her mind refused to name. Her pulse shifted. She followed. The Thornfield Library occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor. Margaret stood in the doorway and could not move. 4,000 volumes. Floor to ceiling, the shelves ran unbroken, the spines catching the afternoon light through tall windows that looked out over the park. Oak ladders on brass rails stood at intervals along the walls, and a reading desk sat beneath the nearest window with a lamp and a chair upholstered in green leather, worn soft at the arms. She could smell the leather and the paper and the particular dust that old pages shed when they are handled with care. A smell she had not encountered since she was 14 years old, and the Lennox Library had still been full, and her mother had still been alive, and the world had still been a place where a girl could sit on a window seat with a book in her lap, and no one called it illness. Her throat closed. Her eyes stung. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe to steady herself, and felt the grain of the wood beneath her palm, and breathed once, twice, and held. "Sit," he said. "Read. You may come whenever Mrs. Campion admits you." "My lord, I could not possibly." "You can." He did not explain. He did not stay. He walked past her into the corridor, close enough that she felt the warmth of his shoulder near hers without contact, close enough that her body registered the clean scent of wool and ink and something faintly green, like crushed rosemary, and the door closed behind him. And she stood alone in a room that held more books than she had seen since she was 14 years old, and the world had briefly been a place where reading was permitted. She sat. She read. Her hands trembled on the pages for the first quarter of an hour, and then they steadied, and the afternoon passed in the deep quiet that only a room full of books can produce. She read a chapter of natural history. She read 30 pages of a Roman history she had heard of and never touched. She read the opening of a novel by a woman whose name she did not recognize, and the prose was so good that she forgot the room and the house, and the Earl in his study down the corridor. And when Mrs. Campion knocked to tell her the hour had come, Margaret looked up and found that the light had moved entirely across the floor, and the candle in the lamp had burned down a full inch, and she had not noticed. Lord Benedict Ashworth had been cold since he was 22. The household knew it. The county knew it. Lady Honoria attributed it to the natural reserve of the Ashworth temperament, and approved of it. Cecily Fairfax found it distinguished. The tenants found it fair, if remote. None of them knew that the coldness had a name, and the name was Eleanor. Eleanor Ashworth had been 17 when she died. She had been Benedict's younger sister, dark-haired and quick, and possessed of a curiosity that the household found charming in a girl of 12 and alarming in a girl of 15. She had written to Benedict at Oxford, letter after letter, asking him to bring her books. She wanted natural philosophy. She wanted the new poets. She wanted the histories their tutor had refused to teach her because they contained battles and politics and were therefore unsuitable for a young woman whose primary obligation was to be suitable. Benedict had not brought the books. He had been 22 and occupied with his own studies and his own pride, and the particular blindness of a young man who assumes the people he loves will wait. He had written back that she would have no need of such books once she was married, that their mother would find her a match by the time she was 19, and that she should trust the path that had been prepared for her. Eleanor had died of scarlet fever in the December of 1806. The books had never arrived. Benedict had carried her last letter in his breast pocket for 8 years. He had built the Thornfield Library in the spring of 1807, 4,000 volumes purchased in 6 months, shelved and catalogued and open to no one. It was the library of a man who was trying to give a dead girl what he had refused a living one, and the silence in the room was the silence of that failure. He had not entered it regularly until the autumn that Margaret Lennox began reading to Mrs. Fenton in the morning room down the corridor, and the sound of a woman's voice reading aloud with her whole body reached him through the walls. If you have been listening this long, you already know what is being built. You know it the way Margaret's body knew it before her mind permitted it, in the shift of a pulse, the held breath at a doorway, the awareness of exactly where he stood in a room without looking. Stay. The worst is coming. And then the best. And the distance between them is shorter than Margaret knows. The reading sessions continued through October. Lady Honoria noticed nothing because she was not built to notice what she had already categorized. Margaret was the odd Lennox girl, a parish duty, a pair of hands that read sermons to old Mrs. Fenton. That the sermons had been replaced by verse and history, and natural philosophy did not register, because Lady Honoria did not inspect the books. She inspected the arrangement, and the arrangement was that Miss Fairfax sat at tea while the Lennox girl read in the other room, and the order of the household was preserved. On the last Thursday of October, Mrs. Garner, the wife of the Hadley rector, stopped Margaret outside the church and touched her arm. "My dear," she said, "I do not know how to say this. Lady Honoria spoke to Mrs. Dalrymple at the linen draper's yesterday. She called you, well, she said the odd Lennox girl reads as though the books were food and she had been starved. She said it was a curiosity and a pity, and that she hoped you would not embarrass her household by forming an attachment above your station." Mrs. Garner's eyes were kind, Margaret's were not. Something behind them had gone quiet and cold, the way a field goes quiet before the frost. "Thank you, Mrs. Garner." She walked home. She did not go to the stable that night. She sat in her room with the candle unlit and her hands in her lap, and felt the full weight of the word that had been fastened to her. Odd. Not accomplished. Not bright. Not worthy. Odd. A curiosity and a pity. The third voicing landed harder than the first two because it arrived as diagnosis, delivered by a woman who believed she was being kind and carried in the specific vocabulary of a hierarchy that could not imagine hunger for books as anything other than deficiency. November came. Margaret went to Thornfield on a Tuesday, read to Mrs. Fenton, and then walked to the library and sat in the chair by the east window, where the light was best. Lord Thornfield was already there. He stood by the mantelpiece with a letter in his hand, and he did not look up when she entered, and he did not leave. They read in the same room for 2 hours without speaking. His proximity was a physical fact in her body, the warmth of him 3 paces to her left, the sound of his breathing, the particular quality of his stillness when he reached the end of a page and paused before turning it. She did not look at him. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a hearth, by heat, and by the knowledge that the room's temperature depends on whether the fire is lit. When she rose to leave, he spoke. Eat something before you walk." He said it without looking up. It was a command. She ate a slice of bread and cold ham in the kitchen, while Mrs. Campion watched her with an expression Margaret could not read, and then she walked home in the dark, with the taste of salt on her tongue, and the feeling that something enormous was being built inside a very small and quiet room. On the 1st of November, Sir Giles found the book. Margaret did not know how. She thought perhaps the stable door had not latched properly, or perhaps the mare had shifted the straw, or perhaps her father had simply looked in the one place he had not yet looked. Because 8 years is a long time to keep a secret inside a house where the walls were thin and the doors did not lock, and the man who owned them believed he was saving his daughter from her mother's affliction. He found the book wrapped in its cloth beneath the straw, and he carried it into the kitchen, and he opened the cover and saw Catherine's handwriting in the margins, and his face did something Margaret had never seen it do. It collapsed, not into anger, into grief so old it had fossilized, and the fossil cracked, and what came through the crack was rage. "You kept this." "Yes. I burned the rest. I sold the rest. I locked the door. I did everything a father should do, and you kept this." It was hers. Margaret's voice did not waver. Her hands, at her sides, were fists. She could feel her nails pressing into her palms, and the ache of the pressure was a relief, because it was a sensation she could name, and the other sensation, the one gathering in her chest, she could not. "It is gone." He put the book into the kitchen fire. The leather darkened. The pages curled. The ink of Catherine Lennox's handwriting, the fine small hand that had looked like pressed flowers, turned to ash and rose in gray threads toward the chimney, and Margaret stood with her hands at her sides and watched it go, and did not scream and did not lunge and did not permit her face to change, because she had learned in 8 years of living in a house where her mind was treated as a defect that the only thing she could control was the surface of herself, and the surface held. The loss moved through her body like a tide pulling the ground from beneath her feet. The page she had torn from the back of the volume months ago, pressed flat inside the lining of her stays, was all that remained. She breathed. She felt the single page against her ribs, the slight stiffness of it where the paper had dried against her skin. She breathed again. Sir Giles turned from the fire. His face was wet. He did not wipe it. He walked past his daughter and out through the kitchen door and across the yard to the stable, where Margaret had kept the book, and he stood there in the empty stall where the cloth still lay folded in the straw. And she heard, through the open kitchen window, a sound that was not weeping and not speaking, and was something older than both. 3 days later, on a Friday evening, Lady Honoria held a dinner at Thornfield to announce what the county had expected since September. Lord Thornfield would make his intentions toward Miss Fairfax known. The table was laid for 24. Margaret was not invited. She heard about it from Phipps, who heard about it from the Thornfield coachman, who said the Dowager had ordered new candelabra and fresh hothouse flowers and a specific arrangement of chairs that placed Miss Fairfax at Lord Thornfield's right hand and left the seat at his left empty, because the left seat was where a man's wife would sit, and it was to remain open as a signal of the vacancy Miss Fairfax was meant to fill. Margaret stood in the stable with no book and no candle, and her hands empty, and the straw beneath her feet still disturbed from where Sir Giles had stood 3 days before. The stable was cold. The mare had been moved to the lower field. The stall was bare, and the air that had once smelled of hay and tallow, and the warm animal patience of a creature that expected nothing, now smelled only of cold stone and old straw, and the particular emptiness of a place that has lost its use. She understood, with the clarity that only loss provides, that she had allowed herself to believe in something that had never been hers to believe in. The books left for her had been charity. The library had been pity. The command to eat had been the kindness of a man who noticed a thin woman and did what men of rank do with things they notice, which is manage them from a distance and move on. She had mistaken care for choice, and the mistake was her own, and the cost of it would be carried in the particular silence of a stable with no book in it. She went to the kitchen. She heated water. She washed her hands until the last trace of ink was gone from her thumb, scrubbing with salt and a cloth until the skin was raw, and the water in the basin was gray, and the hands that emerged from it were clean and plain and unmarked. The hands of a woman who did not read, who did not write, who did not sit in libraries that did not belong to her, and allow herself to believe that the warmth of a man's shoulder as he passed her in a doorway meant anything more than the accident of proximity. Then she sat at the table and folded her hands, and waited for the season to end, and the arrangement to be confirmed, and the library at Thornfield to be closed to her, as finally as the library in her father's house had been closed 8 years before. The Hadley Winter Ball fell on the 23rd of November, and every family in the county attended because the Ashworth name was on the invitation and refusal was not a social option. Margaret came because Sir Giles was expected, and Sir Giles brought his daughter because leaving her at home would invite questions he did not wish to answer. She wore the same cotton gown. Her gloves had been mended again. Her hands were clean. Lady Honoria stood at the entrance to the ballroom in a gown of plum silk with garnets at her throat, receiving each guest with the serene authority of a woman whose plans had proceeded without interruption. Miss Fairfax stood beside her in cream with pearls. Lord Thornfield stood behind them both, and his face, when Margaret crossed the threshold, did not change. She curtsied. She moved to the far wall. She stood where she had stood at the autumn assembly, in the same spot, with the same mended glove, and the room arranged itself around her absence as rooms do when they have already decided what a woman is. Lady Honoria's voice carried. "Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me the greatest pleasure to share that my son, the Earl of Thornfield, has found a companion worthy of his name and his house." The room turned. Margaret's hands went still at her waist. "Miss Fairfax has consented to." "No." The word came from the back of the room. It came from Lord Thornfield, who had moved. He was not standing behind his mother. He was standing in the center of the ballroom floor, and the distance between where he had been and where he was now was the distance a man covers when he has stopped calculating and begun choosing. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation. The airless silence of a mechanism that has been interrupted mid-stroke. Lady Honoria's mouth was open. Cecily Fairfax's hand, which had been rising to accept what she believed she was about to receive, stopped at her collarbone. Lord Thornfield was looking at Margaret. He crossed the remaining distance in 4 strides. He stopped in front of her. The room could see his face, and Margaret could see his face, and what was on it was not coldness, not reserve, not the mask the county had mistaken for his character. It was the particular rawness of a man who has carried a debt for 8 years and has just understood how to pay it. He extended his hand. Margaret did not take it. She could not move. Her body was doing everything her mind had forbidden. Her face was warm. Her pulse was audible in her throat. Her hands, the clean hands with no ink and no book and no glove worn enough to need mending, were trembling. Miss Lennox is to be the Countess of Thornfield. He said it to the room. His voice was level, unhurried, and carried the weight of a man who was not asking permission. 9 words, spoken once, into a silence that had been building since the autumn assembly, when he had looked at the ink on her thumb and known what it meant. The words hung in the air, the way a struck bell hangs after the hand has left it. No one moved. The candelabra flickered in a draft from the door someone had left open, and the shadows on the far wall shifted and resettled. And the room held its shape around the sentence the way a frame holds glass. Lady Honoria's posture broke, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a woman undone. She simply became smaller. Her shoulders, which had been set in the particular architecture of certainty, curved inward. Her mouth closed. She looked at her son, and then at Margaret, and then at Cecily. And what moved across her face was not fury. It was the slow, terrible recognition of a woman who has arranged everything correctly and discovered that correct was not the same as right. Cecily Fairfax lowered her hand from her collarbone. Her face held the expression of someone who has been reading a page and discovered that the text has changed beneath her eyes. She did not weep. She did not speak. She turned to Lady Honoria, and the look that passed between them was the shared bewilderment of two women whose map no longer matched the ground. Mrs. Garner, standing near the punch table, pressed her hand to her mouth. Mrs. Dalrymple, beside her, whispered something that was lost in the silence. Old Mrs. Fenton, seated in a chair brought specially for her, nodded once, slowly, as though she had been waiting for this particular sentence and was satisfied to have heard it delivered correctly. The room exhaled. Margaret looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She saw, for the first time without the barrier of her own wound between them, the man who had left books in rooms where she would find them, who had opened a library he had built for a dead sister to a living woman who read with her whole body, who had stood in a corridor for 7 minutes listening to sermons because the voice reading them had been hers. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold. His closed around them, and the warmth of it ran up through her wrist and settled somewhere behind her ribs, where the torn page from her mother's book still pressed against her skin. "My lord." "Benedict." He said his name as though giving it to her. She held it. The room watched. Sir Giles Lennox stood among the older men near the far window, and his face, which had been set in the rigid composure of a man who believed he had done right, went slack. He looked at his daughter's hand inside the Earl of Thornfield's hand, and something behind his expression shifted, the way earth shifts when the frost beneath it finally gives. He did not speak. He did not need to. The frost had given, and what lay beneath it was the old grief. And the grief was not for Catherine's books. It was for Catherine. It was for the years he had locked the door and believed the lock was medicine, when the lock had only been his own inability to live in a house that still smelled of her pages. He sat down heavily in his chair and put his hand over his eyes, and was still. The wedding was held on the 18th of December at Hadley Church, with snow on the ground and the yew trees black against the white, and the bells ringing in the cold air with that particular clarity that winter gives to metal and to sound. Margaret wore a gown of pale blue, borrowed from Mrs. Campion's sister, and carried no flowers. Her hands were bare. The ink had begun to return to her left thumb. A faint shadow she had stopped scrubbing. And when Benedict took her hand at the altar, his thumb pressed against the mark and held it. He wore his dark coat and stood at the altar with the stillness the county had always mistaken for coldness, and that Margaret had learned to read as the particular discipline of a man who felt things so deeply that stillness was the only structure that could hold them. Mrs. Fenton wept quietly in the front pew. Mrs. Campion stood in the back of the church and did not weep and did not smile, and simply watched with the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for something she had not been permitted to arrange. Sir Giles gave his daughter away. His hand, when he placed hers inside Benedict's, shook once, and then steadied, and he stepped back and sat down and did not look away. The Thornfield Library, on the evening of the 19th of December, was lit by the fire and by the candles Margaret had placed on the reading desk by the east window. Snow was falling outside, slow and steady, the flakes catching the window glass and melting into small bright lines that ran down the pane and pooled on the sill. The room smelled of oak and leather and the beeswax the maids had used that morning, and the fire made small sounds in the grate, the particular language of a well-laid fire in a house that has been warmed for someone's arrival. Margaret sat in the chair that had become hers during those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and the book in her hands was new. Benedict had placed it there that morning without explanation. A volume of verse, the same edition her mother had owned, its leather cover unmarked, its margins empty. Almost empty. On the first page, in his own hand, he had copied a single word from Catherine Lennox's annotation, the word Margaret had recited to him from memory on the evening he had asked her what her mother had written in the margins. Soon. Below it, in his hand, he had added, "Now." Margaret pressed her thumb to the page. The fire crackled. Snow fell against the library windows in the particular silence of a house that had stopped waiting. The torn page from her mother's book, which she had carried against her ribs for the whole of the autumn, lay pressed between the front cover and the title page. The handwriting still legible, the ink still holding. The words finally inside a book again, inside a library, inside a house where reading was not a secret, kept in a stable by candlelight, because the door was open and the candle was not needed, and the morning would come without the need to hide. Thank you for being here until the end. If Margaret's story reached you, leave a quiet word about the moment that held you longest, and come back soon. There are more stories waiting.